David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 44, Our Housekeeping. It was a strange condition of things, the honeymoon being over and the bridesmaids gone home, when I found myself sitting down in my own small house with Dora. It seemed such an extraordinary thing to have Dora always there. When I was kept out very late, it seemed so strange to me as I was walking home to think that Dora was at home. It was such a wonderful thing at first to have her coming softly down to talk to me as I ate my supper. It was such a stupendous thing to know for certain that she put her hair in papers. It was altogether such an astonishing event to see her do it. I doubt whether two young birds could have known less about keeping house than I and my pretty Dora did. We had a servant, of course. She kept house for us. I have still a latent belief that she must have been Mrs. Crupp's daughter in disguise. We had such an awful time of it with Mary Ann. Her name was Paragon. Her nature was repressed to us when we engaged her as being feebly expressed in her name. She had a written character as large as a proclamation, and, according to this document, could do everything in a domestic nature that ever I heard of, and a great many things that I never did hear of. She was a woman in the prime of life, of a severe countenance, and subject, particularly in the arms, to a sort of perpetual measles or a fiery rash. Our treasure was warranted, sober, and honest. I am therefore willing to believe that she was in a fit when we found her under the boiler, and that the deficient teaspoons were attributable to the dustman. But she preyed upon our minds dreadfully. We felt our inexperience and were unable to help ourselves. We should have been at her mercy, if she had had any, but she was a remorseless woman and had none. She was the cause of our first little quarrel. "My dearest life, I said one day to Dora, do you think Mary Ann has any idea of time?" "Why, Dodie?" inquired Dora, looking up innocently from her drawing. "My love, because it's 5, and we were to have dined at 4. Dora glanced wistfully at the clock and hinted that she thought it was too fast. "On the contrary, my love," said I, referring to my watch, "it's a few minutes too slow." My little wife came and sat upon my knee to coax me to be quiet, and drew a line with her pencil down the middle of my nose, but I couldn't dine off that, though it was very agreeable. "Don't you think, my dear," said I, "it would be better for you to remonstrate with Mary Ann?" "Oh, no, please, I couldn't, Dodie," said Dora. "Why not, my love?" I gently asked. "Oh, because I am such a little goose," said Dora, "and she knows I am." I thought this sentiment so incompatible with the establishment of any system of check on Mary Ann that I frowned a little. "Oh, what ugly wrinkles in my bad boy's forehead," said Dora, and still being on my knee, she traced them with her pencil, putting it to her rosy lips to make its mark blacker, and working at my forehead with a quaint little mockery of being industrious, and that quite delighted me in spite of myself. "There's a good child," said Dora. "It makes its face so much prettier to laugh." "But, my love," said I. "No, no, please," cried Dora with a kiss. "Don't be a naughty Bluebeard. Don't be serious." "My precious wife," said I, "we must be serious sometimes. Come, sit down in this chair close beside me. Give me the pencil. There. Now, let us talk sensibly. You know, dear, what a little hand it was to hold, and what a tiny wedding ring it was to see. You know, my love, it is not exactly comfortable to have to go without one's dinner, now is it?" "No," replied Dora faintly. "My love, how you tremble." "Because I know you're going to scold me," exclaimed Dora in a piteous voice. "My sweet, I am only going to reason." "Oh, but reasoning is worse than scolding," exclaimed Dora in despair. "I didn't marry to be reasoned with. If you meant to reason with such a poor little thing as I am, you ought to have told me so, you cruel boy." I tried to pacify Dora, but she turned away her face and shook her curls from side to side and said, "You cruel, cruel boy," so many times that I really did not exactly know what to do. I took a few turns up and down the room in my uncertainty and came back again. "Dora, my darling." "No, I am not your darling, because you must be sorry that you married me, or else you wouldn't reason with me," returned Dora. I felt so injured by the inconsequential nature of the change that it gave me courage to be grave. "Now, my Dora," said I, You are very childish and are talking nonsense. You must remember, I am sure, that I was obliged to go out yesterday when dinner was half over, and that, the day before, I was made quite unwell by being obliged to eat underdone veal in a hurry. Today, I don't dine at all, and I am afraid to say how long we waited for breakfast, and then the water didn't boil. I don't mean to reproach you, my dear, but this is not comfortable." "Oh, you cruel, cruel boy, to say I am a disagreeable wife," cried Dora. "Now, my dear Dora, you must know that I never said that." "You said I wasn't comfortable," said Dora. "I said the housekeeping was not comfortable." "It's exactly the same thing," cried Dora, and she evidently thought so, for she wept most grievously. I took another turn across the room, full of love for my pretty wife, and distracted by self-accusatory inclinations to knock my head against the door, I sat down again and said, "I am not blaming you, Dora. We have both a great deal to learn. I am only trying to show you, my dear, that you really must," I was resolved not to give this up, "accustom yourself to look after Marianne, likewise to act a little for yourself and me." I wonder I do at your making such ungrateful speeches," sobbed Dora. "When you know the other day when you said you would like a little bit of fish, I went out myself miles and miles and ordered it to surprise you." "And it was very kind of you, my own darling," said I. "I felt it so much that I wouldn't on any account have ever mentioned that you bought a salmon which was too much for two, or that it cost £1.6, which was more than we can afford." "You enjoyed it very much," sobbed Dora, "and you said I was a mouse." "And I'll say it again, my love," I returned 1,000 times. But I had wounded Dora's soft little heart, and she was not to be comforted. She was so pathetic in her sobbing and bewailing that I felt as if I had said I don't know what to hurt her. I was obliged to hurry away. I was kept out late, and I felt all night such pangs of remorse as made me miserable. I had the conscience of an assassin, and was haunted by a vague sense of enormous wickedness. It was 2 or 3 hours past midnight when I got home, found my aunt in our house sitting up for me. "Is there anything the matter, Aunt?" I said, alarmed. "Nothing, Trot," she replied. Sit down. Little Blossom has been rather out of spirits, and I have been keeping her company, that's all." I leaned my head upon my hand and felt more sorry and downcast as I sat looking at the fire than I could have supposed possible so soon after the fulfillment of my brightest hopes. As I sat thinking, I happened to meet my aunt's eyes, which were resting on my face. There was an anxious expression in them, but it cleared directly. "I assure you, Aunt," said I have been quite unhappy myself all night to think of Dora's being so, but I had no other intention than to speak to her tenderly and lovingly about our home affairs." My aunt nodded encouragement. "You must have patience, Trot," said she. "Of course, heaven knows I don't mean to be unreasonable, Aunt." No, said my aunt, "but little Blossom is very tender. It's a very tender little Blossom, and the wind must be gentle with her." I thanked my good aunt in my heart for her tenderness toward my wife, and I was sure she knew I did. "Don't you think, Aunt," said I, after some further contemplation of the fire, "that you could advise and counsel Dora a little for our mutual advantage now and then?" "Trot," returned my aunt with some emotion, "no, don't ask me such a thing." Her tone was so earnest that I raised my eyes in surprise. "I look back on my life, child," said my aunt, "and I think of some who are in their graves with whom I might have been on kinder terms. If I judged harshly of other people's mistakes in marriage, it may have been because I had bitter reason to judge harshly of my own. Let that pass. I have been a grumpy, frumpy, wayward sort of woman a good many years. I still am, and I always shall be, but you and I have done one another some good, Trot, at all events. You have done me good, my dear, and division must not come between us at this day and time, or at this time of day." "Division between us?" cried I. Child, said my aunt, smoothing her dress. "How soon it might come between us, or how unhappy I might make our little Blossom if I meddled in anything. Profit I couldn't say. I want our pet to like me, and to be as gay as a butterfly. Remember your own home in that second marriage, and never do both me and her the injury you have hinted at." I comprehended at once that my aunt was right. I comprehended the full extent of her generous feelings toward my dear wife. "These are early days, Trot," she pursued, "and Rome was not built in a day, nor a year. You have chosen freely for yourself." A cloud passed over her face for a moment, I thought. "And you have chosen a very pretty and a very affectionate creature. It will be your duty, and it will be your pleasure too, of course, I know that. I am not delivering a lecture to estimate her as you chose her, by the qualities she has, and not by the qualities she may not have. This is marriage, Trot, and heaven bless you both in it, for a pair of babes in the woods as you are." My aunt said this in a sprightly way, and gave me a kiss to ratify the blessing. "Now," she said, "light my little lantern, and see me into my bandbox by the garden path." There was a communication between our cottages, and there was a communication between our cottages in that direction. With my aunt tied up, her head in a handkerchief, I escorted her home. With this, my aunt tied up with her head in a handkerchief, and I escorted her home. I was much impressed for the first time in reality by the conviction that Dora and I had indeed to work out our future for ourselves. Dora came stealing down in her little slippers to meet me, now that I was alone, and cried upon my shoulder, and said I had been hard-hearted, and she had been naughty, and I said much the same thing in effect, I believe, and we made it up, and agreed that our first little difference was to be our last, and that we were never to have another if we lived 100 years. The next domestic trial we went through was the ordeal of servants. Mary Ann went so mildly on receipt of wages that I was surprised until I found out about the teaspoons, and also about the little sums she had borrowed in my name of the tradespeople without authority. After an interval of Mrs. Kidgerbury, the oldest inhabitant of Kentish Town, I believe, who went our charring, but was too feeble to execute her conceptions of that art, we found another treasure, who was one of the most amiable women, but who generally made a point of falling either up or down the kitchen stairs with the tray, and almost plunged into the parlor, as into a bath, with the tea things. She was succeeded, with intervals of Mrs. Kidgerbury, by a long line of incapables, terminating in a young person of genteel appearance, who went to Greenwich Fair in Dora's bonnet, after whom I remember nothing but an average equality of failure. Everybody we had anything to do with seemed to cheat us. Our appearance in a shop was a signal for the damaged goods to be brought out immediately. If we bought a lobster, it was full of water. All our meat turned out to be tough. It appeared to me, on looking over the tradesmen's books, as if we might have kept the basement story paved with butter. Such was the extensive scale of our compensation of that article. I don't know whether the excise returns of the period may have exhibited any increase in the demand for pepper, but if our performances did not affect the market, I should say several families must have left off using it, and the most wonderful fact of all was that we never had anything in the house. As to the washerwoman pawning the clothes and coming in a state of penitent intoxication to apologize, I suppose that might have happened several times to anybody. Also, the chimney on fire, the parish engine, and perjury on the part of the beadle. But I apprehend that we were personally unfortunate in engaging a servant with a taste for cordials, who swelled our running account for porter at the public house by such inexplicable items as quartern rum shrub, Mrs. C., half-quartern gin and cloves, Mrs. C., glass rum and peppermint, Mrs. C. The parentheses always referred to Dora, who was supposed, it appeared, on explanation, to have imbibed the whole of these refreshments. One of our first feats in the housekeeping way was a little dinner to Traddles. I met him in town and asked him to walk with me that afternoon. He readily consenting, I wrote to Dora saying I would bring him home. It was pleasant weather on the road. We made my domestic happiness the theme of conversation. Traddles was very full of it, and said that picturing himself with such a home and Sophie waiting and preparing for him, he could think of nothing wanting to complete his bliss. I could not have wished for a prettier little wife at the opposite end of the table, but I certainly could have wished when we sat down for a little more room. I did not know how it was, but there were only two of us, But though there were only two of us, we were at once always cramped for room, and yet had always enough room to lose everything in. I suspect it may have been because nothing had a place of its own except Jip's pagoda, which invariably blocked up the main thoroughfare. On the present occasion, Traddles was so hemmed in by the pagoda and the guitar case and Dora's flower painting and my writing table that I had serious doubts of the possibility of his using a knife and fork. But he protested, with his own good humour, "Oceans of room, Copperfield, I assure you, oceans!" I could not help wondering in my own mind, as I contemplated the boiled leg of mutton before me, previous to carving it, how it came to pass that our joints of meat were of such extraordinary shapes, and whether our butcher contracted for all the deformed sheep that came into the world. But I kept my reflections to myself. We ate as much of it as was done, and made up with capers. If I had permitted him, I am satisfied that Traddles would have made a perfect savage of himself, and eaten a plateful of raw meat to express enjoyment of the repast. My poor little wife was in such affection when she thought I should be annoyed, and in such a state of joy when she found I was not, that the discomfiture I had subdued was very soon vanished, and we passed a happy ending. When Traddles went away, and I came back into the parlour from seeing him out, my wife planted her chair close to mine and sat down by my side. "I am very sorry," she said. "Will you try to teach me, Dodie?" "I must teach myself first," said Dora. "I am as bad as you, love." "Ah, but you can learn," she returned. "And you are a clever, clever man." "Nonsense, Mouse," said I. "I wish," resumed my wife after a long silence, "that I could have gone down into the country for a whole year and lived with Agnes." Her hands were clasped upon my shoulder, and her chin rested on them, and her blue eyes looked quietly into mine. "Why so?" I asked. "I think she might have improved me, and I think I might have learned from her," said Dora. "All in good time, my love. Agnes has had her father to take care of for these many years. You should remember, even when she was quite a child, she was the Agnes whom we know," said I. "Will you call me a name I want you to call me?" inquired Dora, without moving. "What is it?" I asked with a smile. "It's a stupid name," she said, shaking her curls for a moment. "Child-wife." I laughingly asked my child-wife what her fancy was in desiring to so be called. She answered, without moving otherwise, that as the arm I twined about her may have brought her blue eyes nearer to me, "I don't mean you, silly fellow, that you should use the name instead of Dora. I only mean you should think of me that way. When you are going to be angry with me, say to yourself, 'It's only my child-wife.' When I am disappointing, say, 'I knew a long time ago that she would make but a child-wife.' When you miss what I should like to be, and think you can never say, 'Still my foolish child-wife loves me,' for indeed I do." I had not been serious with her, having no idea until now that she was serious herself. But her affectionate nature was so happy in what I now said to her with my whole heart that her face became a laughing one before her glittering eyes were dry. She was soon my child-wife indeed, sitting down on the floor outside the Chinese house, ringing all the little bells one after another to punish Jip for his bad behavior, while Jip lay blinking in the doorway with his head out, ever too lazy to be teased. When my evenings were unoccupied and I was engaged in writing at home, she would sit quietly near me, however late the hour, and be so mute that I would often think she had dropped asleep. But generally, when I raised my head, I saw her blue eyes looking at me with the quiet attention of which I have already spoken. "Oh, what a weary boy," said Dora one night when I met her eyes as I was shutting up my desk. "What a weary girl," said I. That's more to the purpose. You must go to bed another time, my love. It's far too late for you." "No, don't send me to bed," pleaded Dora, coming to my side. "Pray don't do that." "Dora!" To my amazement, she was sobbing on my neck. "Not well, my dear? Not happy?" "Yes, quite well, and very happy," said Dora. "But say you'll let me stop and see you write." "Why, what a sight for such bright eyes at midnight," I replied. Are they bright, though? Returned Dora, laughing. I'm so glad they're bright. Little vanity, said I. But it was not vanity. It was only a harmless delight in my admiration. I knew that very well before she told me so. If you think them pretty, say I may always stop and see you write, said Dora. Do you think them pretty? Very pretty. Then let me always stop and see you write. I am afraid that won't improve their brightness, Dora. Yes, it will. Because, you clever boy, you'll not forget me then, while you are full of silent fancies. Will you mind it if I say something very, very silly, more than usual? Inquired Dora, peeping over my shoulder into my face. What wonderful thing is that? Said I. Please let me hold the pen, said Dora. I want to have something to do with these many hours when you are so industrious. May I hold the pens? The remembrance of her pretty joy when I said yes brings tears to my eyes. The next time I sat down to write, and regularly afterwards, she sat in her old place with a spare bundle of pens at her side. Her triumph at this connection with my work, and her delight when I wanted a new pen, which I very often feigned to do, suggested to me a new way of pleasing my child wife. I occasionally made a pretense of wanting a page or two of manuscript copied. Then Dora was in her glory. The preparations she made for this great work, the apron she put on, the bib she borrowed from the kitchen to keep off the ink, the time she took, the innumerable stoppages she made to have a laugh with Jip as if he understood it all, her conviction that her work was incomplete unless she signed her name at the end, and the way in which she would bring it to me like a school copy, and then, when I praised it, clasp me round the neck, are touching recollections to me, simple as they might appear to other men. She took possession of the keys soon after this, and went jingling about the house with the whole bunch in a little basket tied to her slender waist. I seldom found the places to which they belonged were locked, or that they were of any use except for a plaything for Jip. But Dora was pleased, and that pleased me. She was quite satisfied that a good deal was effected by this make-believe of housekeeping, and was as merry as if we had been keeping a baby house for a joke. So we went on. Dora was hardly less affectionate to my aunt than to me, and often told me of the time when she was afraid of a cross old thing. I never saw my aunt unbend more sympathetically to anyone. She courted Jip, though Jip never responded, listened day after day to the guitar, though I am afraid she had no taste for music, went wonderful distances on foot to purchase as surprises any trifles that she found out Dora wanted, and never came in by the garden and missed her from the room, but she would call out at the foot of the stairs in a voice that sounded cheerfully all over the house, "Where's Little Blossom?" And that is the end of chapter 44.